Why is A Christmas Carol a classic, whilst Daniel Quorm and his religious notions is not? Why is The Lord of the Rings a classic? Why do we call it a classic, whilst we don't call The Toy Box by Jackie Quesada Immortalised Trilogy Volume 1 a classic? It's not an insult to those other books, but we know we call one of those books a classic and the other one we don't call a classic. I'm interested in the concept of classics, what a classic is. In part, I guess, I am a classics scholar academically, in the Latin Greek sense. That's part of what I do. In other ways, I like reading lots of classic sci-fi and fantasy, don't I? And I've explained before on this channel why that is. I'm interested in the idea of classics in literature. What makes something a classic? How do I define it? How is it a useful category, perhaps? Now, I don't want to talk about, is it objectively great? Because, I mean, here's an easy answer. This is a great book and this is an okay book. This is a classic, this is not. I don't want to talk about objective greatness. I do believe beauty is objective. I think artists use the subjective knowing of it and description of it. But that's not really what I'm interested in today. Classic or canonical status is a social phenomenon, not an aesthetic phenomenon. It's a disputed social phenomenon with different views about it. It's subjected to the hermeneutic of suspicion. You can feel free to look that one up. But it's quite real. Certain books have a settled status as cultural touchstones at different levels, as widely respected or used texts. Why? What renders a book a classic? And of course, I should say there are lots of canons and lots of ways of being a classic. There are classic graphic novels. There is the fantasy canon. There's kind of dramatic canon in terms of plays. You could say there's philosophy and memoir canons, things that people have to read in those areas. There's a British canon, an Irish canon, an American canon, there French canon, whatever else. Obviously, for me, when I think about the idea of canon and classics, I'm broadly thinking about Anglophone or translated into English literature. I'm usually thinking, when we're in this kind of conversation, about fiction and maybe poetry, though it could be about something else. But it doesn't really matter what. I want to kind of talk about the general features of the idea of what a classic is, how you enter the canon socially. One thing that does not mean a classic is not... So, sometimes people say a book is not a classic for this reason, and I don't think so. The fact that a book is not incredibly popular right now does not mean it is not a classic more generally. Otherwise, a very good book being disapproved of by a relatively small number of people for a relatively short time would decide the thing forever. A book can be eclipsed for a time, but still be canonical, still be part of the shared literature of, in the context we're talking about, the Anglophone world. It doesn't need to be universally popular. Shakespeare was badly neglected in the original texts after the Restoration, all the way through, really, till quite late into the 19th century. The 18th century you start to see an interest, but really it's the 19th century. 150 years Shakespeare is barely performed in the original scripts. You have things being rewritten with sections taken out of it. You have vastly condensed versions. Shakespeare, literature is a hard product to translate particularly and export, particularly dramatic literature and poetic literature. But Shakespeare is a universal canonical figure in modern world literature. But for 150 years he was forgotten, or at least rather severely neglected. So that doesn't mean it's not a classic. The fact it is temporarily not popular, the fact that something you might think is a classic is not popular today, does not mean it is not a classic. We're talking about a far broader concept of classic and canon than current opinion or opinion 50 years ago or whatever else. We also might as well say up front, or I might as well say up front, that one way that books get elevated as classics is, or they get removed from that status, is by nefarious means. Generally speaking, the decision of elite tastemakers for ideological reasons, for preferential reasons, not for kind of any other reason. We're allowed to read it and we're encouraged to read it, or it's sort of removed as far as possible from our purview due to nefarious motives. And this isn't just something that happened in the distant past where there were people deciding what you were and weren't allowed to read. This has happened in every era in history. There are always elite tastemakers who are always telling you and I what's good and what's bad. In fact, they have a role, don't they? Reviewers, we call them. Critics, we call them. But ultimately, this nefarious method of elevating inferior works, perhaps over controversial superior works, is of much less lasting value and importance than we might think. And I say that because partly since the invention of the printing press, it's very hard to eliminate texts completely, so they can always have a resurgence and renaissance. Even before the printing press, and we've lost so much from particularly the classical world, you have so many footprints of works that you know that things must have existed, and you begin to get some of the conversation around them. And that's when we're talking about stuff where 99% of the literature of an era is missing, and we still have some idea about the greats that we are missing from that era, the things that were widely accepted as good. Partly also, as tastes change, the elite tastemakers of 100 years ago or 200 years ago do not hold the same weight. They cannot control what you read now. The cream rises and stays risen, and the skim separates down. What happened, for instance, I was thinking this the other day, what happened to John Updike? 50 years ago or 30 years ago, whatever, a critical darling, and now forgotten. Does that mean he's not classical or canonical? Not necessarily, but it does mean that the taste that elevated Updike as one of the great novelists of our time has declined and virtually disappeared. What happened to the massive pro-empire poetry that was not by Kipling, or pro-empire fiction that was not by Kipling? On the other hand, works which suffer moral disapproval but have real lasting quality survive, or tend to survive at least. Consider the works of Kipling. I've done a review of Kim. Edward Said, the cultural critic, actually talks very positively about it while criticising what he sees as negative morally in it. More controversially, consider the Nazi filmmaker Lenny Riefenstahl, the great filmmaker of the 30s, who for many decades made no films, made I think one documentary not long before she died in her 90s. But Lenny Riefenstahl, obviously no one's saying, oh well, let's defend Nazism by appreciating her works, but she is an important canonical figure in cinematic or filmmaking, and certainly in propaganda and marketing history. And so she's studied on that basis, and she's accepted on that basis. Or, again, so Herbert Spencer, social Darwinist extraordinaire, incredibly popular in the late 19th century as a philosopher. No one reads Herbert Spencer now. I would bank that no one ever will, outside of very specialist circles, read Herbert Spencer again. But Friedrich Nietzsche is not just popular and retains some power in the imagination, but is also accorded canonical status. The Twilight of the Gods, or Thus Spake Zarathustra, or The Antichrist. These are books that have canonical status, despite the fact that Nietzsche had some very unpleasant views in most of our opinions. Something else has distinguished those examples, your Riefenstahls, your Kiplings, your Nietzsches. Something else means Riefenstahl is still studied and respected. Of course, you may say, well, I'm actually a big fan of everything that Lenny Riefenstahl, Friedrich Nietzsche, Herbert Spencer, Rudyard Kipling, etc., stood for. And we're not talking about, of course, the objective moral qualities of works here. We're trying to talk about the social phenomenon of how something is accepted or rejected as a classic. So just to be clear. So we know some works last and some do not in that sense. And over the broad swath of time, it's not only or solely conspiracy that means some works are elevated. Otherwise we wouldn't even know the countercultural works existed, and which we now elevate and say, wasn't that a wonderfully countercultural work? Wasn't that really important at the time? We certainly wouldn't recognise the achievements of those we otherwise disapprove if there was not a function that was separate from relatively temporary approval or disapproval of some aspect or another of the work. Time then is the first great sorter. Longevity is the first mark of the classic. If something can be engaged with generation upon generation and survive waves of disapproval and obscurity, then it must have something going on. But what contributes to that survival? We've kind of given the meta answer. A classic is something that lasts. But I think there are four other factors which I think explain in part why a particular work lasts. For a work to stay broadly canonical, to be widely read or at least widely known, something has to be widely comprehensible to the population who share the canon. What I mean is this. It's complicated. What about foreign language classics? Dostoevsky, for instance, or Virgil, or Homer, or Gilgamesh. The Brothers Karamazov is in Russian, and it's surely a classic. It's surely canonical. We recognise it as such in English, despite being from a different language. Chaucer is a classic despite being a very difficult version of the English language to read. Beowulf is in English so foreign that it's not readily comprehensible. But I mean, there is a route to comprehensibility for those books that allows familiarity and approval to renew in the next generation, to occur in the next generation. Beowulf and Dostoevsky get translated. Chaucer is still close enough to modern English to, with a bit of work and a bit of help, make comprehensible, as well as translations and stuff. Shakespeare, particularly when performed, people don't watch Lerman's R and J and think, wow, this is completely incomprehensible. Even though it is in a more archaic English than we speak now, it's still comprehensible to us. And as translated, it can become comprehensible to other people as well. You know, Schiller loved him, didn't he? If translations were not available, if a little extra assistance or dramatic staging were not available, then these works would, in a functional sense, fall out of the canon recognised by, in our example, the English-speaking world. It doesn't mean they'd be bad works. This is part of the point I'm trying to make about separating, it's just about objective beauty from the social phenomenon of the canon. There has to be a comprehensibility, which means that people can share the work. The second thing that I think lends itself to this is dangerously close to talking about aesthetics and objective truth and stuff, but I think canonical works have to have a sort of relative openness and relative accessibility, relative attractiveness in their format and expression, even if they're complicated. I don't just mean you have to be able to read them, I think they need to also be at some level aesthetically attractive, and I'm using as a measure of that just popularity, just the fact that people like reading something as a measure, the fact it gives pleasure and delight. What I mean is that the very enjoyable story with very mediocre prose does not become canonical. As an example, I wouldn't want to say Jackie Cassave's prose is mediocre, but it's not amazing. This is a fun story from the Changeling the Dreaming RPG universe, but it's not amazing, and that's going to be one limitation upon it, even though it's okay. The fact that someone writes pleasantly but not very pleasantly is a problem. So Henry Newbolt, I've got here, Victorian poet, wrote a couple of very, very nice poems. Vitae Lampada, for instance, is a really interesting poem. The Drake's Drum, The Fighting Temerary, By the Hearthstone. These are interesting, enjoyable poems. But Sir Henry Newbolt is forgotten because some indescribable quality of what people enjoy is limited there compared to some of, say, Kipling. We've given the example already of a direct contemporary of his. Of course, some difficult writers are canonical. So I don't mean a book has to be simple to be canonical. What I mean is that it has to be accessible aesthetically. So Ulysses by Joyce, or the Four Quartets, which I have somewhere here, the Four Quartets by Eliot. They are difficult books, but they are definitely canonical, aren't they? Within their sub-canons, at least. The Four Quartets is considered by many people to be the best long English poem from Tennyson to the present. The point is that their expression is still attractive enough and effective enough to entice the audience. On the other hand, Finnegan's Wake, Joyce's magnum opus, really, is not really canonical. At least it's not canonical in the way that we're talking about, where something is part of the shared canon of a people. Because it's so difficult to read. It gathers specialist interest, not just academic, but also kind of hardcore interest. And that's great, but the closeness means its aesthetic value is so disputable, it can't attain the wide audience required for canonicity. The third feature, and this kind of connects on from that, universality. Comprehensibility is a precondition, but universality is the existential core of what makes something canonical. So I was talking with a friend the other day. There's a line in the TV series WandaVision, "What is grief but love persevering?" And I think it's a really brilliant piece of screenwriting, whatever you think about the rest of that series. His comment was that basically the task of screenwriting is one of condensation of important things. And you could say that's getting the ideas into a scene that expresses them so that you know what's happening in the rest of the film, but also in those single lines which sum up big existential experiences, big common emotions and experiences of human beings. And that sentence is aesthetically pleasing, what is grief but love persevering, very well weighted, and it sums up a universal or nearly universal experience. And that's true with great comedy too, to stay on the kind of televisual side of things, or the the visual side of things. Cary Grant's screwball comedies of the 30s and 40s do not pretend, on the whole, to any great experience. I mean, maybe the Philadelphia Story, I mean, maybe Holiday as well, because, of course, Screwball, like all comedy, is an underrated vehicle for seriousness. But the point is, why is His Girl Friday probably the funniest of those films? Not just a very funny film, but something canonical, something integral to modern Western art and thought within its subfield, even to those who have never seen it. Why is it something where you could watch a parody of it without ever having seen it, without having seen any Screwballs of the 30s and 40s, and get the joke? Why is that? There's something in the perfection of language and exuberance that articulates something universal to us, I think. The joy in language, maybe, the fact we are speaking animals. And if such a comedy effectively brings us more serious themes, and not just Cary Grant's films that I've mentioned, but say Kevin Smith or Simon Pegg's films, then the universal nature of the work is deepened, because the two kind of combine, don't they? So so when we come to books, then, condensation of human experience, whether emotional or intellectual or social, is a powerful factor in canonicity, in becoming a classic. Terry Pratchett and L. Sprague de Camp both wrote comedy fantasy. Both were very important in their time. I've read both of their works and they're both enjoyable. But it's Pratchett who is canonised, despite being British and offbeat in a fantasy market which is heavily American. If you want a more controversial comparison, on the same note, Pratchett looks to be a better lasting author than his compatriot and co-genreist Douglas Adams. Adams did write classics, I think, but the reason Pratchett was a master in his field, the reason that I think his books will, essentially the fact that they enter into wider conversations about fantasy and art now in a way that maybe only Hitchhikers does for Adams, is because Pratchett was brilliant at condensing human experience in his comedies in a way that registers at multiple levels. And finally, classic status is self-perpetuating in one way. And I'll explain what I mean, not just the sheer inertia of, oh, no one can be bothered to think about it, but rather, if a book is comprehensible, if it's attractive in its expression, attractive enough at least on a majority vote to keep people coming to it, and if it's universal, then it can survive generationally as a touchstone. I remember being at a cricket match once, and it was lunchtime, and I went up to the members' lounge to have lunch, and in the northeast of England, two working class northeastern chaps in their 70s or 80s, and they're talking to each other, and they started talking about Shakespeare, not the Shakespeare they'd learned together at school. They hadn't gone to the same school, they weren't, I think, exactly the same age, but they both read Shakespeare, and they were sharing their memories of Shakespeare being taught to them in the 40s or the 50s, a long time ago. They hadn't gone to school together, but they had this cultural touchstone, and it's one not just to their generation, but to mine as well, so long as Shakespeare is retained in the canon. One thing that makes something a classic is that it is shared through time, including with the long dead. I speak the tongue of my forefathers, though mutated. I share their culture, though developed. All of it's very changed, but I literally own my great-grandfather's furniture and his Strand magazines. A classic isn't just an abstract status of considered good, because you could just say, well, I've worked out the objective measure, I know all the top 100 books ever, that's the canon now. But there's something else. The canon also is something that acts as a measure of a culture and connects generations. And of course, you can always add more classics. That's one thing that sometimes people who like classics and like a canon struggle with. But of course, there are always classics being added to the canon. It's not a one-in, one-out thing. Well, we really like Jackie Casada's The Toy Box, so we'll get rid of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. We really like this, so we'll get rid of this. That's not how it is. You don't have to bin older books to let newer voices in once they fulfilled whatever criteria there are. All sorts of writers get included as well. This is one of the things about elite tastemakers having, at best, an ambivalent effect. For instance, V.S. Naipaul and Rabindranath Tagore are pretty indisputably canonical writers in the kind of British sub-canon, despite being colonial subjects who weren't necessarily enormous fans of their colonial master. W.E.B. Du Bois is probably I'm not as much of an expert here, but is probably a canonical American writer in a particular kind of memoir and argument subgenre of the 20th century, despite the fact that it was very controversial at the time, and still is. There are things about Dubois which will be very controversial to other people. Even more controversial on the other side of some of the same race political discussions, Will Percy, Lanterns on the Levees, has some very disturbing moments. It has precisely the opposite race politics to Dubois in lots of ways, but these are both voices in one canon. Not in the top 100 books ever written in the English language, but in one part of the canon, in one corner, they are both classics. And I think, by the way, that's one reason why canons and classics are good, in my view. The ordinary processes of time render fairer judgments than we do from our limited historical perspective. Many voices, more vibrant and in debate with each other, like so many old counsellors and entertainers and family members and friends. You can't escape the idea of there being a canon. Either it is decided by historical accident, or someone now is deciding it. We might as well, I think, try to let it speak to us, to let all these conflicting voices who finally seem to speak with the one voice of the culture speak to us. Eliot put it like that in that difficult classic, The Four Quartets. Let me see if I can find the thing I'm thinking about from Little Gidding. Not Ash Wednesday, that is good, maybe it's later on. Oh yes, it's right at the back. What a great poem. So this is what Eliot says. It is not to ring the bell backward, nor is it an incantation to summon the spectre of a rose. We cannot revive old factions, we cannot restore old policies or follow an antique drum. These men and those who oppose them, and those whom they opposed, accept the constitution of silence, and are folded in a single party. Whatever we inherit from the fortunate, we have taken from the defeated, what they had to leave us. A symbol perfected in death. The canon is the list of authors and books who are folded into the constitution of silence, but who now offer us this single thing, and it can always be added to, it can always be expanded, new voices can always be recognised, but it becomes this touchstone that unites people of very different kind of subcultural backgrounds but into a wider conversation, sometimes fractious and difficult, but so long as there is that shared canon, it's possible. Some of those views anyway may be controversial, some of them may be ones you really agree with or really disagree with. You may have a very different view on what is a classic, how it is decided, how the canon is formed. I would really love to hear from you in the comments about that, because that's part of the conversation, isn't it? So tell me in the comments, what is a classic to you? How do things get into the canon of whatever genre or whatever area, subject matter, or whatever language you're thinking about? Till next time.